Okay, you're going to notice immediately I'm far less organized than Tom is. He's one of the most organized teachers I've ever seen before. Not to mention, I started at about 9:30 last night. So we are in Colossians chapter 3. Tom has been describing that Paul has been on a theme of the preeminence of Christ. So he's been going through the preeminence of Christ, not only in the assertion of it, but also in the defense of it. And what we kind of talked about yesterday was how there's going to be objections to that, and there's going to be those who are standing against it. He went over, the Judaizers and the agnostics and those who might be standing against the doctrines of Christ. And so what I want to do this morning, I've kind of chosen kind of a central theme, but if you go to chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, I want to note that Paul is going to stress multiple times the critical role that love is going to play in this whole process. So in chapter 2, verse 1, "For I would that you knew what great conflict I have for you and for them at Laodicea, and for as many as have not seen my face in the flesh." So he introduces chapter 2 by saying there's this conflict he has for this congregation. He's going to go into the first matter that has caused conflict within him in verse 2, that their hearts might be comforted, being knit together in love. So the conflict he has in chapter 2 as he begins this section is, with all these matters of the preeminence of Christ and all those who are going to object and stand against it, my heart struggles because since I can't see your face right now, I don't know how much love is playing out in this scenario. So what we're going to see here in chapter 3, I think, is the central theme of love is going to be that is going to play a very, very important role in making sure that he gets through not only these objections and they get through this faith and they get through the understanding and preeminence of Christ. So as you enter into chapter 3, if you'll go to chapter 3 with me, in the first 7 verses in Colossians chapter 3, in the first 7 verses, he's going to represent the two options that someone can have. He says, "If ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. For ye are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, shall appear, then shall ye also appear with him in glory. Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry, for which things' sake the wrath of God cometh on the children of disobedience, in the which ye also sometime when ye also walked sometime when ye lived in them." The first 7 verses deal with the two options that someone has. Those two options are where your affections are. One option is your affection can be on earth. He's going to identify what it means to have your affection on earth. Those who have affections on earth are those who are alive to sin still. They haven't put sin to death. They're still living under the rule of sin. In fact, in verse 7 it says, "Ye lived in them." So you have one option of living in sin. And by the way, I do want to point out in this list in verse 5, those are things that you can live in. That's why we talk about living in adultery and living in fornication, because the Bible clearly says that's something that someone can live in. That is, you stay in that state of that sin until you mortify that thing, until you put it to death. That is one option for someone, and that is someone whose affection's on earth. And by the way, if you have an affection on future earth, you fall into this category, because he's going to contrast that with your affections being the second option, affections being above. And he makes it very clear in verse 2, you have to set your affections above. The result of that is going to be alive to Christ. Another way of putting that is you are saved. That is the other option. You're either affections on earth and you're dead and alive to sin. You're dead to Christ and alive to sin. Or your affections above, you're alive to Christ and you are saved. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 30. One of the verses that stands out there is that he says that Christ is our life. Deuteronomy chapter 30. And I want to point out, because Deuteronomy is going to make a very similar, if not the identical expression here. And I think it's going to describe for us what it means as to Christ being our life. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, goes me to verse 20. Deuteronomy 30 and verse 20. He says that thou mayest love the Lord thy God, and thou mayest obey his voice, thou mayest cleave unto him, for he is thy life. He is thy life. Does everybody see that? Now, I want you to note what he goes on to say in this description of he is thy life. "And the length of thy days, that thou mayest dwell in the land which the Lord sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and give them." There's two aspects of this God being their life that I want to point out is described in this verse. There's the physical life aspect. You are alive, and you will continue to be alive because of God. So when he says the length of your days, he's talking about the very fact that you have life has its origins in God. Now, remember what we talked about in Colossians chapter 1. Not only did Christ create all things, but he described the fact that by him all things what? Consist, continue to live and exist. So you have a certain aspect of your life is Christ, from the aspect of the fact that the very fact that we're here, the fact that you woke up this morning, the fact that we are alive, the fact that we continue to live is found in God, is found in Christ. The second aspect, though, if you go back to verse 20, that thou mayest love the Lord thy God, notice the love connection there, that thou mayest obey his voice, thou mayest cleave unto him. The second aspect of Christ being your life is, he is literally your purpose for living. He is your spiritual purpose for living. So not only are you alive because of him, he is the reason you are alive. And he gives you purpose spiritually for the life that you live. So he not only sustains our life, Colossians 1 verse 17, but he also is our purpose for living. And if you have another purpose for living, Paul is commending and instructing and exhorting, go back to Christ being your purpose in all that you do for the life that you have right now. If Christ is not your purpose, put him as your purpose. That's why you're here. You can do all these other things on the side, get a job, have a family, those things. But your ultimate spiritual purpose in this life is Christ. It's to live for Christ, to live for God. So back in chapter 3, those are your two options in Colossians chapter 3. You can be alive to sin and have your affections on earth, or you can have your affections above and in fact be alive to Christ and be saved. Christ who is your life. I think that's a remarkable verse in Colossians 3 verse 4. There's a transition in Colossians 3 and verse 8. And this is where this section, the next section, where I spend most of our time. In Colossians 3, verse 8, you have a transition. He says, but now ye also. So I want to focus in on three of those words. We have but now. So but now is the way they used to be in verse 7 versus the way they are now. So when you see but now, he means now that you're a Christian. Now that you've put those things off, now that you're a Christian, he's entering into this section by identifying that's not you now. It was you then, but it's not you now. So this would be the stage, in fact, that we are in, those of us who are Christians in this room are in. Ye are a new man now, you've put off the old man. He says ye there, but now ye. Now the ye in the immediate context is, of course, the church at Colossae. But I want to point out in chapter 4, verse 16, and when this epistle is read among you, cause it to be read also in the church of Laodiceans. This, by implication, means this isn't just the church of Colossae, it's Christians. He's talking about Christians, but now Christians. That equally applies to us, because he wasn't just saying this is just for Colossae. He's saying this is going to be read in other churches. This is just a church thing here. So, but now ye, the ye, not only Christians at Colossae, but by extension also any Christian. And then he says, but now ye also. So the also means he has just expressed in verse 5 a list of things that they had to put off. But what he's saying is, I'm not done yet. This list of things is not exhausted. The list I've just gone through is not exhausted. These are a lot of things you need to put off. But also, he's going to go into some other things. Since we are a new man and since we're a Christian, this is how we ought to conduct ourselves. And so he's going to go into also things that are additional to what he has just described in verse 5. Now, I will note some of the things that are described in verse 5 are, I think, a future panel like fornication. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time on that in this class. But those are things that were put away. And then he's going to go into also some additional things that need to be put away. So that's going to be as we start into this section here. So go with me to chapter 3, verse 8 and 9. I want to note the first thing. The first thing also you need to put away. In chapter 3, verses 8 and 9, Christians should give attention to their tongue. And by tongue, of course, we mean their speech. Christians should give attention to their speech. In chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. But now ye also put off all these. So that's where the also comes in. Anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communication out of your mouth. Lie not one to another, seeing that you have put off the old man with his deeds. So he says also, in addition to the list in verse 5, also these are the other things we need to be put off. You need to give attention to your tongue, your speech. Look in James chapter 3. James 3 is perhaps the most famous context for which Scripture will go into the importance of a Christian, a new man, someone who's put off the old ways, is to control himself, and that matter is in the tongue. In James 3 and verse 8, he says, but the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. Now some people read that verse and they'll reach a conclusion. That means it's inevitable. I cannot avoid sinning by my tongue. And if we reach that conclusion, you need to go back and read James again. Because James has already expressed the fact that we can be a perfect means mature, not sinless, but mature Christian, and control the tongue. So what he's saying here is not that it's impossible to control the tongue. The unruly evil in the Greek has to do with the idea, and I mentioned this before, it's the idea of a caged animal. And if you've ever been to the zoo, and particularly the big cats, and they're walking back and forth in that cage, the one thing on their mind is, I want to get out of this cage. That's the idea from the Greek. So it's unruly because it's restless, it wants to get out. So the idea in James 3 and verse 8 is, it is certainly possible for us to control what we say. Can you imagine if God said, control your speech, but by the way, it's impossible to do it? God's not going to do that. So we certainly can control our speech, but what's being expressed here is, we can't ever let it off its leash, is what I like to say. You always have to keep it on its leash. You can't let your tongue just go off and say whatever it wants, because then it's unruly. It wants to say things that you shouldn't be said. What we should always do is keep our tongue on their leash. And what is meant by James 3 and verse 8 is, it doesn't matter if you're at 15 or 95. You have to keep your tongue on the leash. That's a part of Christian maturity. There's never a point at which you can say, okay, now I can just say whatever I want. In fact, having been to nursing homes and been around older people, sometimes that leash either gets longer or kind of frays and starts to break, and they lose their filter. So certainly you have no excuse, unless you've actually lost your faculties, to just let your tongue off of its leash. It means to be maintained. That's a part of Christianity. So he says Christians should give attention to their tongue in Colossians chapter 3. The next thing, go back to Colossians chapter 3. And because of time, I normally when I teach a class would open it up for questions and comments, but we are pressed for time since we have to get through the whole chapter. And so if there's time at the end, we can certainly open it up for that. In Colossians chapter 3, go with me to verse 12. Colossians 3, verse 12. The next thing that he says is that Christians are going to give attention to their thoughts in their heart. The thoughts in their heart are going to help you with the tongue problem. Because if it's not in your heart, it's not going to come out of your mouth. And that's why when you hear these hypotheticals about, what if I'm on the road and I've lived a righteous Christian my whole life, but then right as a 18-wheeler comes to hit me, I say a curse word. How'd that curse word get in your heart? That's what the Bible's describing. That shouldn't have come out of your mouth, because if it came out of your mouth, it was in your heart. So if you were this fantastic Christian this whole time, but that word came out of your heart, then you got a heart problem. You got a heart problem. That's what he's saying. To fix this tongue problem, you got to fix the heart problem, because the tongue is going to flow out of the heart. In chapter 3, verse 12, he says, put on therefore as an elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercy. Bowels are insides. Kindness, humbleness of mind, that's heart. Meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. I want you to note there the emphasis on the mind, the insides. Go down to verse 15. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts. He ends that verse by saying, be thankful. That's an attitude, a heart thing. Verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you. That's in your heart, in your mind. I keep on pointing here, but it's in your mind, your heart. He says, you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. That is, my singing, my praise of God flows from the grace of God in my heart. And sometimes people, because they don't have the grace of God in their heart, they don't keep the grace of God in their heart, perhaps what flows forth from their mouth is not what's being described here, because it's an inside thing. It's a heart thing. So he talks about here the things that are in man. The word of Christ should be in the heart. The grace of God should be in our heart. Kindness, humility should be in our heart, in our mind. Forgiveness, all those things. So Christians should give attention to their thoughts and to their heart. And again, I'm middle-aged, but I don't think there's ever a time in the rest of your life where you can let your thoughts out of control. Now, some older people can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But when I go through Scripture and I realize very quickly that Satan is not a dummy, he's not going to tempt an old person the same way he tempts a young person. And Paul will describe to Timothy the youthful lusts. There are lusts that are very specific to young people that the devil's going to use. But listen, we as older people should not be tempted by those things anymore. We should have moved on. Those should be long in our rearview mirror. But does that mean the devil can't tempt us? No. So if it's not lust of the eyes, if it's not lust of the flesh, it must be the pride of life as I get older. That's a heart issue. So I think even more so as we get older, we need to pay attention to our thoughts and our minds and our hearts, because those are the things that we're going to be struggling with. Again, I'm middle-aged, but I presume based on what I read in Scripture, that's the things that we'll be struggling with as we get older. And we shouldn't be struggling with those fleshly things anymore. We can't be childish. We got to put those things away. So mind issues, heart issues. Okay, number 3, Christians should understand the ultimate role that love plays in all of this. So this is our central verse that I want to kind of use as our springboard for the rest of the class, Colossians 3, verse 14. Again, he's introduced in chapter 2 the connection that love has to all of this. And he's going to say it again in chapter 3, verse 14. Above all these things, I don't want you to miss that. Above all these things, everything he's just listed and described, at the very top of it, above every single one of them, above all these things, put on. He's been describing things you need to put off. This is the top priority of putting on charity, that's agape love, which is the bond of perfectness. So I want to just stress once again, Paul is emphasizing the critical role that love plays in everything we've been talking about. It's the central heart, the central theme, and I want you to note some of the descriptions there. It says that it is the bond, or it binds. In Colossians 2, verse 19, go back to Colossians 2, verse 19. Not holding the head, from which all the body by joints and bands. Same word. The idea there in the Greek is that of ligaments. So, again, I'm not medical, so I like to look at pictures so I can imagine this in my brain. The tendons are what bind the muscle to the bones. Ligaments are what bind the bones to the bones. So he's describing love as the thing that are the ligaments that tie every other aspect of this together. What if I'm missing love? What if our bones were missing ligaments? I'll let you respond to that. What if our bones are missing ligaments? We would just be, there's a medical term. We would just be a pile of bones. Nothing connected, just a pile of bones. The thing that holds the whole picture together is love. That's why he says it's the top, above all other things. If love is missing, nothing else is going to work. This is what Paul is saying. We sometimes don't understand the important aspect, the critical aspect that love plays in this, and this is what Paul is describing here. Look in chapter 2, verse 2. He also mentions in chapter 2 and verse 2 that it's a tie or a rope, a bundle or a load, Colossians 2, verse 2. What we read earlier, that their hearts might be comforted, being knit together in love. So he uses the language in chapter 3 of ligaments. In chapter 2, he uses the idea of bundling something together or knitting something together. If you take that bundle off of that wheat, what's going to happen? It's all going to be separated and fall apart. If you take, now again, I don't sew. I have to ask my wife about things, but I imagine, based on what my wife has said, if you take that big strand there that knits the whole thing together and you take it out, what's going to happen? It's just yarn again. This is his description of love. It holds the whole thing together. If you're missing love, every single aspect of it falls apart. Go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. So he also says, it is the bond of perfectness, or what we might say is maturity. It's that which is the thing that makes you mature. And so a lot of people remain immature because they don't understand, or at least they don't implement love. It keeps you immature without it, because love is that which is the perfect bond of maturity. Without it, you're immature. You can have a bunch of other things, but without love, you're still immature. Look in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 1. Look at some of the things that you can have without love. Though I speak with tongues of men and of angels and have not love. So they could have miraculous gifts from the Holy Spirit and not have love. What's the product of that? Vain, useless. Those miraculous gifts become pointless without love. Look in verse 2. Though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, in the context which is miraculous. What if you are an apostle with all the knowledge that God has given to you as an individual? There was always a portion of the gift given to Christ, but that portion that was given to the apostle, what if you had that extended great portion of knowledge without love? It means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. He goes on to say, though I have all faith. Now, all faith in this context is important because there was miraculous faith, and then there is faith that extended beyond the miraculous. And we note that by verse 13. Now abideth faith. So there is the faith that you and I can have. Then there is the miraculous gift of faith. But let's say you have all of that. Let's say in this first century scenario, they were given a gift that resulted in faith, and they had natural faith as a result of the Word of God, Romans 10:17. What if they had all of that? If they didn't have love, it doesn't matter. That's what he's saying. It renders all the faith in the world useless. Look in verse 3. Though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, I have not love, it profits me nothing. What if I give to those who are in need? Are you telling me, Paul, that there's a potentiality that I can give to someone and do it without love? That's what he's saying. And I can give everything to the extent of my own body in sacrifice to something, but without love, it becomes an absolutely useless sacrifice. Love is what makes this whole thing possible, necessary, and holds it all together. Does everybody see that? Look at me in 2 Peter chapter 1. And so the other apostles, in addition to Paul, are going to support this idea of love holding it all together. In 2 Peter chapter 1, go with me to verse 5. 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning verse 5. 2 Peter 1, beginning verse 5. Peter gives kind of an order here. Beside this, giving all diligence, add to your faith. So we're starting at the foundation of faith. That's the beginning point. Virtue. And to virtue, you add knowledge. That's gnosis in the Greek. I want to bring that up because there's an important distinction here in a moment. You add to your faith virtue, and to virtue gnosis, knowledge. And to knowledge, temperance, or self-control. And to temperance, patience. And to patience, godliness. And to godliness, brotherly kindness, phileo love, which has already been mentioned. And to brotherly kindness, love. And notice what the last one is, love. And you're thinking, I thought it was love should be the first one. No, love is the pinnacle of maturity. And people walk around talking about love and throwing around love in an immature state, not understanding that it's the pinnacle that you reach for. And if you don't have any of these things prior, you're not going to attain biblical agape love. It's the pinnacle, it's the apex. He goes on to say, for if these things be in you and abound, if is conditional, they make you that you shall neither be barren nor unfruitful in epignosis. Epignosis is mature knowledge. So you know what we have to do? In our immature state, we have to add knowledge and add knowledge and add knowledge. And our end goal is mature knowledge, epignosis. And where do I find mature knowledge? He's already identified that in verse 3. According as the divine power hath given unto us all things that pertain to life and godliness through epignosis. Epignosis, in that verse, is all things that pertain to life and godliness. So until I have matured to that stage, I'm adding gnosis to gnosis to gnosis. And then I'm aiming for mature knowledge in that context. I can never attain that without love. Does everybody see that? I can never attain it without love. 1 Peter, go with me to 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4. And all the things that Peter describes in 1 Peter, he gets down to verse 8 and says this, above all things, have fervent love among yourselves. Above all things. Why does it say above all things? Because it is the apex. I can't stress this enough. That's what Paul is getting into. My heart is concerned for you not being there in person because I struggle to determine whether you actually have love there. And if you don't have love there, everything else I'm saying falls apart. It holds a thing together. And so love is this deep thing. It's not just this thing that you claim. This is why we tell people, look, love is more than just a claim. And I know that for wives, because sometimes their love language is words of affirmation, wives maybe like to hear that a little bit more than men need to hear it. But if you're not showing it, then we got a problem. If you're not showing love, we've got a problem. You've got to display your love because it's the apex, not the beginning. It is the mature level that we're reaching for in Colossians chapter 3. So Christians should understand the ultimate role that love plays in all this process, and we're going to continue to look at that as we continue. I think this is Paul's emphasis here in this chapter, in the last two chapters, chapter 2 and 3. Amongst all the preeminence of Christ and all those who rise up against it, I think love is at the heart of these things, and he's worried that it's absent. And if it is absent, then there's no purpose in anything else in this book. It's not going to work. You're missing the most vital ingredient. So, an ignorance of biblical love. There is, a lot of people throw around the word love, and I think there's an ignorance of biblical love, and that ignorance of biblical love keeps more people in spiritual immaturity than anything else. An absence of biblical love keeps more people in spiritual maturity than anything else. So I want to look at, as we continue this class, what the Bible has to say about that. So, offering love, here's some aspects of biblical love. Offering love or extending love does not depend on the response of the receiver of our love. It does not depend on the response of the receiver of our love. Look in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 19. Colossians 3, verse 19. Husbands, love, that's agape love, your wives, and be not bitter against them. Agape love is a commandment in this context for a husband, for a wife. And by the way, with the exception of Titus, this is not a commandment of the wife to the husband. It's a commandment of the husband to the wife. The husband is the sacrificial one in the relationship. It should be. You have this sacrificial love of the husband to the wife. So, how I respond in any relationship, we say this in marriage, and this is the example given here, but any relationship, how I respond to someone, whether I extend love or not, does not depend on how they treat me. It doesn't depend on what they give back to me. That's not what my love depends on. When I extend love and someone does not extend love back, I don't stop extending love because it doesn't matter how they respond. Agape love is sacrificial. In fact, if anything, when Paul says, it seems like the more I love you, the less you love me, Paul keeps on loving them more. That's what he's saying. I love you more and more, though it seems like you love me less and less. But that doesn't stop Paul from loving them more and more. It does not depend on how someone treats me. And so I say oftentimes in marriage counseling, I cannot control how others treat me. I can only control how I respond to them. I cannot control what someone else does. People would like to sometimes, but I can't do it. I cannot control how someone else acts. I can only control how I respond to how they act. That's the only thing I'm in control of. I'm in control of me, or I should be in control of me. That's love. Love is I extend it regardless of how I'm treated or what returns. Look in Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13. Paul will describe to the church at Rome the fact that love is something that is owed to someone. We owe it to someone. When you owe something, that means that there's a debt represented. In Romans chapter 13 and verse 8, owe no man anything but to love one another. That's the debt we have. Love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. So here's the question though. I owe love to my brother. Who do I owe it to? Is it because my brother, I owe a debt to my brother necessarily? I don't think so. This is why he says the rest of that verse, he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. Whose law? My brother's law? God's law. My debt is to God. I love my brother because I'm indebted to God to love my brother. I'm not indebted to you necessarily to love you. I'm indebted to God to love you. That's what I owe God. Why do I owe God to love you? Because what he extended to me first was love. I love others because he first loved me. I owe that to God. And the moment we start to say within ourselves, but you don't understand how someone treats me. Think about how people treat God every single day. Think about how we treat God. Think about how you treat God. Think about how I treat God every day. And then we start griping about what about this person treats me? It doesn't matter. I owe love to them because of God, not because of them. Look in Colossians 3, verse 23. I have 3 verses written at the beginning of my Bible, and I've done this since 3 Bibles ago. And I do not switch Bibles readily because I have to copy all my notes over. So I've had this one for a long time. One of those is Colossians 3:23. It may be my favorite verse in the Bible. Whatsoever ye do, do it heartily. Heartily means your full heart, as to the Lord and not unto men. That's what we're talking about. Love is I'm doing it for the Lord. I'm not doing it for you. Because I'm not going to stand before you on Judgment Day. I'm going to stand before the Lord on Judgment Day. My love is expressed to you, or should be expressed to you, because of the Lord. Is everybody with me? It doesn't matter how you respond to me. I can only control me. And so I extend love back. Colossians 3, verse 23. Go back to Colossians. The next thing I want to note is love puts others before self. Love puts others before self. In Colossians chapter 3, we're going to get to the child-parent relationship in a moment, but I also want you to note in verse 22, the servant-master relationship. A lot of people would have some difficulty in how they treat someone who is over them. And that seems to be, he does this in almost all the prison epistles, doesn't he? He talks about the relationship of master to servant. And that's because apparently a lot of people, and not just people in the first century, but people struggle with that authority under authority relationship. And so I think one of the things that's going to indicate is an absence of love. Look in Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. Love puts others before self. Philippians 2 verse 3. Philippians 2 verse 3. Let nothing be done through strife or vain glory. That's your intent and purpose behind what you're doing. If your purpose is strife, if your purpose is vainglory, don't do it. But in lowliness of mind, which goes back to your thoughts and your mind, let each esteem others better than themselves. Not esteem me better than you, esteem you better than me. That's the Christian mindset. Because I owe love, sacrificial love to you because of God. Colossians 3 verse 23. Look in Titus chapter 3. Titus chapter 3. Not loving others can deliver us to envy. And I think this is one of the things when you read about in the church, to the church at Corinth, why Paul goes into love. They were envying over spiritual gifts. And what was absent in that whole process was Paul is saying, I don't think you love each other. Based on the way you're treating each other, I don't think you actually love each other. So spiritual gifts aside, there's the problem. The church at Corinth was struggling with it, and there was in fact that envying of one another. In Titus chapter 3, verse 3, for we ourselves also were sometimes foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving diverse lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy. Notice that living in malice and envy. They were continuing in malice, continuing in envy without repenting. Hateful and hating one another. An absence of love. Do you see what results from an absence of love? An absence of love results in malice. That's evil intent. And the absence of love results in envy. We can start to envy one another. When you read about in the warfare language in the book of James, at the end of the book of James, and he's talking about the warfare language, when he talks about you fight and devour and consume one another and go to war against one another, that's an absence of love. Your willingness to do that is an absence of love. And he says this here, it is hating one another. That's an absence of love. Titus chapter 3, verse 3. We know 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4, love envieth not. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4. But an absence of it, of course, is going to result in envy. Look in Colossians chapter 3, verse 21. Colossians 3, verse 21. What love genuinely does is it genuinely wants what is best for others. Genuinely, it wants what's best for others. Colossians 3, verse 21. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. I would encourage you to look up that word discouraged there. It means to be spiritless or disheartened. So I want you to know the relationship of father to child, a father to son, for example. If you want to get me riled up, and I may be exposing too much of myself, but if you want to get me riled up, attack the innocent. That's my big one. You attack a child, I don't even mean physically. If you hurt a child or hurt an old person, like a widow or something, that's going to set me off. So if you want what sets me off, there it is. Because they are defenseless. They don't have someone else to defend them. So that one sets me off. And I've mentioned before I study at McDonald's sometimes. I do that to kind of keep me alert and keep me awake, and enough happens at McDonald's, interesting enough, to keep you alert and awake. But one thing I witness almost every time I go there, I'll be sitting there studying, and someone walks in. It's usually you grumpy old people. I'm going to be honest with you. It's you grumpy old people. Some grumpy old person walks in, and who's behind the counter? A teenager who's like this. That's the worst combination in the world. Grumpy old person plus teenager like this. It's just a bad combination. And then grumpy old person walks up and says, I want 3.5 sugars, and I want it to be within 3 minutes, or I'm going to get even grumpier. And that's how they come up. And the teenagers are like, listen, I don't get paid enough for this. So they go back and they spit in the coffee, and then there's your coffee with 3 sugars and spit. That's what I get to witness. And the grumpy old person just yells at them. He said, let me see your manager. I see this almost every time I'm at McDonald's. Maybe I should go study somewhere else. Maybe not. I don't know. But people walk up and say, hey, I noticed you're studying the Bible. So I do it for that purpose also. It keeps me alert and it provides opportunities. You know what angers me the most about that situation? It's not the teenager. That's not what makes me angry. What makes me angry is a grumpy old person. Because what you don't know, grumpy old people, is what that teenager has at his home. One parent, maybe no parents, having to struggle to get by. They don't have what you have. And you walk up and they're trying to make ends meet and get paid. I'm a libertarian, so I don't want you to think I'm saying we should raise the minimum wage. Don't raise, that's not a solution. But what I'm saying is they're getting paid very little in comparison to what you have, grumpy old person. And then you're going up and making their day even worse. And this is what he's talking about. We live in ways sometimes where we cause children to be disheartened. And then you wonder why children are flocking away from the church. It's because how they were not raised properly and how we mistreated them. I don't look to them because they are still, if they're usually within their home under a teenage level, they're innocent. When I get up and I drive to the church building and you see on the softball field, the baseball field, children playing baseball on a Sunday morning, every single child on that field is innocent. I'm not mad at those children. The ones who are not innocent are the parents up in the stands saying, yay, I took my child out of worshiping God to do this nonsense. That's what makes me angry. And so when he says in Colossians chapter 3, in verse 21, Fathers, provoke not your children to anger lest they be discouraged. We can't dishearten the youth. That doesn't mean you can't correct them. The Proverbs writer says you don't stop disciplining a child because they cry. They're going to cry. No child is always disciplined. You don't stop disciplining because they cry. You discipline them in the Hebrews because you love them, Hebrew writer says. We had fathers in the flesh, and they corrected us, and we love them now because of that. But what we can't do is dishearten them. We want to encourage their heart. And listen, that involves love. So when it says it puts others before self, it has to be genuine. You can't fake your love for your child. You can't fake it. They're going to pick up on it that you don't actually love them. And I hear stories about fathers coming home from work and then the children want nothing else but to see them. They haven't seen them all day. And then fathers come home from work and they plop down the recliner, turn on the television and say, don't bother me. You had these children. You committed to being a father. You committed to training these children. And what you're doing now is neglecting them. That's what you will answer for. And you are disheartening them. That's what the Bible says. I would encourage you just not to have television. That'll prevent that. That's what the Hall House does. There's ways to prevent you acting like that if you struggle with it. We have to make sure we are putting others before ourselves. That includes your children that you brought into this world and made the decision. They didn't make the decision to come in this world. You did. So we cannot leave them spiritless or disheartened. Number 3, love is not hypocritical. Love is not hypocritical. Wow, I'm really behind. Sorry. Love is not hypocritical. Look in Colossians 3, verse 22. Colossians 3, verse 22. Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers. What does that indicate? It's the possibility in serving someone. You're just doing it to be seen. And Jesus dealt with this, didn't he? Just to be seen by men. Sometimes we do things just to be seen. He says, that is not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about doing it because you genuinely actually mean what you're doing. You're not hypocritical. Hypocritical is saying one thing and doing another, or doing one thing and saying another. That's hypocrisy. Look at back in Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. Go to verse 9. Romans 12 and verse 9. Let love be without dissimulation. That's hypocrisy. Love cannot go hand in hand with hypocrisy. So again, I tell the preaching students this, in my classes at least. I say you can't get up and fake that you mean it. I've seen preachers sometimes who, they write it down in their notes. Pause for effect. Open your eyes, shed a tear at this moment. You can't fake being genuine. And every person out in this audience knows you're just faking it. And I'll tell you one thing that is the fastest turn off for me is a fake in the pulpit. I'll just speak for myself. You can't fake being genuine. But what you can do is conduct your heart in such a way where you actually mean it. And if you actually mean it, you don't have to fake it. It's just going to come because you actually mean it. That's why we say you don't need to, as a preacher, you don't become someone else. If you're becoming someone else, it's fake because that someone else is not you. Be yourself and be genuine. That's what he's talking about. Love is not hypocritical. Look in Colossians 3 verse 9. Colossians 3 verse 9. It demands that I speak the truth. It demands that I speak the truth because it's not hypocritical. Hypocrisy means I say one thing and do something else. And sometimes it's difficult to find it out until eventually you find out the fruit that, oh, they're saying one thing and meaning something entirely different. Because we can't know hearts, we can find it by the fruits. In Colossians 3 verse 9, lie not one to another, seeing that you have put off the old man with his deeds. I have to speak the truth to you. Sometimes the truth is not enjoyable, but I speak the truth and I don't lie to you because love is without hypocrisy. Now, I may not know immediately that you're lying to me. You may not know immediately that I'm lying to you. I could be the most wicked person in this room and be faking it to all of you. I could. Now, I'm going to go to hell for that, so I'm not going to sleep at night if I'm actually that way. But listen, I could be a fake, a complete phony. Hopefully people will start to catch on that if I'm a phony. But listen, I could be a fake and I can be a phony. You're not fooling God. And eventually, you won't be fooling man anymore. It demands I speak the truth with my brother, with my neighbor, with everyone. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25. Ephesians 4, verse 25. He connects it to love. Wherefore, putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Speak the truth with your neighbor, for we are members one of another. That goes to my relationship with one another. I speak the truth because my actions need to match my words. Number 4, love demands the forgiveness of even the worst sins. Let's go to Ephesians 2. We'll go to Ephesians 2. Love demands the forgiveness of even the worst sins. Now, not the forgiveness of sins that have not been repented of, not the forgiveness of sins that have not been confessed, but the sins that have been repented of and confessed. I would go to Luke chapter 13 for that concept. It forgives the worst of them all. Love does. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, if you go down with me to Ephesians chapter 2, go down with me to verse 4. Ephesians 2, verse 4. But God, who is rich in mercy, for his great love, wherewith he loved us. Here is his love being displayed. Even when we were dead in sins, he hath quickened us together with Christ. By grace are you saved. Why did God forgive us in our sins? Why? Because he loved us. Because he loved us. Love ties it all together. That was God's motivation for it. Why does God put up with John Hall day in, day out? Because he loves me. That's why. And so love demands the forgiveness of the worst sins. We need to do that for one another as well. As someone comes and repents of that sin, we forget it. We forgive it. God says in the book of Hebrews, he forgives and forgets. That doesn't mean our brain falls out of our head. Remember that Paul will readdress the fact that when Stephen was stoned, he was standing there consenting to it. Did his brain fall his head and now he forgot what he did to Stephen? No. He says, I was a part of it. But what Paul says in Philippians 3 is, I had to put those things behind me in order to press forward. So forgiveness means we move on. That's tied to love. After that, repentance takes place. And finally, I know we're out of time. Finally, love has always been expected of the Lord. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 24, Colossians 3, verse 24, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance. It's expected of the Lord for my inheritance. For ye serve the Lord Christ. So it's always been expected by God. In fact, 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 9 says, love is something that is taught. Sacrificial love is not something that's natural to a child. Watch a baby and you're not going to understand sacrificial agape love. You'll understand like dependence, they know where to go. But this, we're talking about agape sacrificial love, which is a mature love. It's commanded by God and it has to be taught. And this is exactly what Paul is doing in order to help the church at Colossae and Laodicea and all the churches so they are not going into what he's afraid they might be going into and giving into these temptations and sins around them. Got any time for questions or comments?
Yeah, 1 minute.
Is there 1 minute comment or question?
Hey, God, did you
Yes, sir.
that the passage in Titus is for women to love their husbands is actually phileo and their own children,
Yep.
which is more of the ideal of, and sometimes we say this, I'm not a friend of my child, but the Bible commands me to have that kind of love. That's the kind of love that they're teaching.
There's an aspect of liking your children, and this is one thing that I've sometimes noticed with mothers is, I also watch them make McDonald's, and I start to think, I don't think you even like your children. And if I didn't already have 4 and a 5th one on the way, I'd say, give me your child, because at least I'll like them. I didn't even give birth. I didn't give birth to any of my children. I wasn't even a part of that child, and I'll like him more than you do. There has to be a genuine, I want this child because I actually want them. There's too many people who are willing to give that up. I think we're out of time. Thank y'all.
lesson is going to be outstanding, and I'm going to give you a 10 and a 5-minute warning. That's 10, that's 5, all right? And so we'll turn it over to you.
Well, we are in summer now in Texas, and if you pull up on your map getting directions or you look at the weather app, you'll probably see things that state there is a heat advisory. But if you grew up in the 1970s, you might remember something called global cooling. Starting about the 1940s going forward, there was a trend of temperatures declining, and in 1975 there was a Newsweek article published that talked about this period of global cooling. Now, to be fair, this was not a scientific consensus. Most of the papers at this time were not predicting an ice age, but it was popularized in the media. Moving on into the 1980s and 2000s, we see an increase in temperature based upon all the weather stations scattered around the globe, and this introduced something called global warming. In fact, our former vice president to Bill Clinton, Al Gore, he published a documentary called An Inconvenient Truth shortly after he lost to George Bush in 2000. And in that documentary, he made several claims or predictions, such as global temperatures rising, the ice melting, sea level rising. I believe he even said that New York would be underwater by now. He said CO2 concentration was to blame for all of this. There would even be refugees fleeing different countries due to the climate. Well, get to the mid-2000s and things kind of stall out. We have a kind of a small decline, and it changes from global warming to climate change. Continue on, and temperatures continue to go up, but climate change is easier to depict whether it goes cooling or warming or stays flat. And from here we get things like the Paris Climate Agreement, where countries sign up and pledge to limit our CO2 emissions in an effort to limit global temperatures rising to less than 2 degrees centigrade over the next 50 or 100 years. And it produces things like ESG, environmental social governance, which tries to force corporations to explain what their carbon footprint is and to reduce their carbon footprint by paying a tax for carbon or by reducing their fossil fuel consumption. This is why when you go to book a flight now, it'll say this flight is going to produce this much CO2 emission versus this flight in an effort to get you to produce the one that may cost more, but has a lower CO2 emission. And we've seen this impact the culture. You might have seen this young girl. She's 22 now, recently made headlines for traveling on a boat to Israel, Palestine. Greta Thunberg, travel around and yell at people for their carbon emissions. It always is ironic to me when I see these photographs, because I play a little game in my head. How many things are they using to protest that require carbon or hydrocarbons to produce? Yeah. But it's led to people defacing property such as art, even some throwing soup on the Mona Lisa. We've seen it lead to individuals blocking traffic in the name to bring climate awareness. And as you could anticipate, if you stop people on a highway, that's going to make some people pretty angry, especially if you're trying to get to that job interview or take a sick child to the hospital. Led to one individual in Panama, he got so fed up with it, he just got out of his car and shot 2 of them, killed 2. We've even seen the impact within Christendom. We see churches who are now speaking out saying that we must act on the climate now, even some who will disrupt church services in the name of climate action. In fact, in 2019, at the Union Theological Seminary in New York, a Presbyterian-associated school of religion, they had a chapel in which they confessed to plants. And here's what they said. Many of us have a disconnected relationship with nature and relate to nature as outside things as it. Today, we will try to create a new connection by talking to the plants, soil, and rocks and confess how we have related with them. Confessions are also a form of mending relations, healing, and changing our ways. We are all the manifestations of the sacredness of life, and the we of God's love is way beyond the human. So let us confess to each other, including plants, soil, rocks, rivers, and forests. It led one student to say this: "I don't know how to relate to you in this subjective way, and I'm afraid that if I do, I might discover a level of pain that I don't know whether I can bear." Former Pope Francis, he said, "Climate change is a problem we can no longer be left to a future generation." And we even see this impact even on the outskirts of the Lord's church, if I can use that loosely. Alden Bass, actually raised in a conservative Christian home, interned at Apologetics Press way back when. He was formerly a professor at Oklahoma Christian, now he's at Lipscomb. Here's what his bio says. He has taught courses on Scripture, early Christianity, social justice, Christian community, love and the human condition, green discipleship, technological ethics, death, suffering, and spiritual formation. I looked up this class on green discipleship. Here's the description. This course explores what the Christian theological tradition teaches about how humankind ought to be in relationship with the rest of creation. Focus will be on, but not limited to, Christianity and key theological themes and perspectives, while also seeking to discern possible promising foundations for responding to ecological concerns. I couldn't find his exact class, but I did find a class he taught on social justice. And in one of his lectures, he made the following point. He said, "Earth is not a resource to be used, but a gift to be cherished and protected." So we need to be talking about these things because unfortunately as it goes, we see the culture will impact Christendom and the Christendom eventually leads into the Lord's church. Sadly, it should be the other way around. We should be speaking truth in the Lord's church that should impact Christendom broadly and then impact the culture. And so this morning we're going to focus on two subjects, the Ice Age and climate change. And I'm going to break them into two separate parts. We're going to start with the Ice Age because that gives us understanding on how we understand climate change. But I want to remind you that there's two competing views of Scripture. You have concordism and non-concordism. Concordism would suggest, and I believe this is the biblical view, that God is the source of all truth. And so whether we're studying his natural laws, the laws of physics, the laws of science, or reading his written revelation, they should coincide and be in harmony. But most in the academic circles today hold to a non-concordism position, and they look at science separately from Scripture. They say Scripture, that's good for good moral teachings, but science, that's the real human history. Psalm 33 and verse 4, "For the word of the Lord is right, and all of his work is done in truth." Again, if both his creation, his physical creation, and his written revelation are from God, they should coincide. Or to put it this way, when God said, "Let there be light" in Genesis 1 verse 3, he also could have said Maxwell's equations that describe the relationship of electricity and magnetism. Both are a true statement. Both come from the same source of truth, God. So as we look at these subjects, we're going to break them out into the biblical perspective and the secular perspective. So we'll start with the biblical perspective of the Ice Age. The biblical perspective is that there is one Ice Age, and that Ice Age was the result after the global flood that happened approximately 4,000 years ago. Unfortunately, many times when we teach children about Noah and the ark, we read to them books like this or hold VBS that makes Noah's ark look like a big floating zoo. Everyone's smiling and happy, and it's a good time. But I wish we did a better job of emphasizing what the flood represents, and that's God's view of sin towards wrath and destruction of this world because of that sin. And from clues from the Genesis account of creation, from the events of Noah and the flood, creation scientists have created a model. We use the acronym HEAT to describe this. It stands for hot oceans, evaporation, aerosols, and temperatures. And what it's describing is that at the time of the flood, the Earth's surface was totally transformed. And it produced a lot of volcanic activity, a lot of tectonic activity, and it created the perfect environment to send our world into an ice age. If you go back about 70 years ago, the idea of plate tectonics wasn't accepted. But today, via satellite data and other forms of evidence, we know that the plates on top of Earth's surface do move, and today they move very, very slow, about a few centimeters to a few inches per year. But it is consensus, even among creationists and secularists, that the Earth used to have one supercontinent. We call that Pangea. And I believe that the Bible gives us hints at when God broke that supercontinent up during the flood. In Genesis 7, verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. We then see towards the end in Genesis 8, verse 2, the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and rain from heaven was restrained. Dr. John Baumgartner, a geophysicist, used to do research at Los Alamos National Laboratories. He started studying this problem and modeling this idea of the plates moving on top of the Earth's surface. So just to explain that a little bit, on the surface we have all these plates. This is on the Earth's crust. It's hard material. And below that we have the mantle. It's a lot hotter. It's more fluid-like. And we see where these plates will diverge and converge, where they will collide together and pull apart. And as a result, there is a lot of volcanic activity that will ensue. And so what he showed is that as you take this cold crustal material and you subduct it underneath another plate into the hot mantle, you get this pulling runaway effect that actually would imply that the continents were moving on the order of feet per second or meters per second during the flood. And so he modeled this out by solving the conservation of energy equations. And we're able to test this hypothesis through seismographic imaging, tomographic imaging. This is where you put seismometers, geophones all along the surface. You measure earthquakes, and then you create an image of the subsurface. And if you were to look across North America, what you see is the Pacific plate has subducted underneath the North American plate. Well, if that was going just over a few centimeters, a few inches per year, cold material down into hot material, you would expect it to heat up and assimilate with that mantle. But instead what we see is it's still cold material that resides underneath us today. It's why California has all the volcanic activity. It's why Wyoming, you have a supervolcano, more volcanic and tectonic activity on the western part of the United States. Here's a three-dimensional model showing that subducted plate. This is also evidence that the Earth is not that old. But leading to this heat model, we had a lot of volcanic activity. This is a map showing all the volcanic regions across the globe. And it's interesting from a secular perspective, all of this volcanic activity occurred around the same time, the mid-Cretaceous period. I'm going to hone in on one area, the area boxed up there. It's called the Shatsky Rise. That one volcanic area is about the size of California. I studied this in graduate school. This used to be considered the largest volcano in the world, just one complex there of Shatsky Rise called Tamu Massif, actually named after Texas A&M University, because my professor, when he discovered it, was a professor at A&M. But this one volcano here is the size of New Mexico. All right, I want you to keep that in perspective. That one volcanic complex is the size of the entire state of New Mexico. Well, how important, how much can volcanoes change or impact climate? Well, in 1980, we had a volcano only 6 miles wide, Mount St. Helens. It erupted for only about 9 hours and emitted over 540 million tons of ash, an area of over 22,000 square miles. What were the impacts? If you were alive, you might remember some of these. Actually shut down air traffic for a couple of days. And if you live there in the Washington, Oregon area, it dropped temperatures by about 15 degrees very quickly. It's because when all these aerosols went up into the atmosphere, it blocked the sunlight and dropped temperatures. Well, a few years ago, you may not have heard of this one, another big volcano went off. The reason you probably didn't hear about it was underwater. It's called Tonga Hunga Ha'apai. Erupted in 2022 in the South Pacific Ocean. But the interesting thing about this eruption was all the water that it emitted up into the atmosphere, over 150 metric megatons of water vapor, about 10% of the current water vapor levels. So, bringing all this together, all this volcanic activity would have heated up the oceans. We would have had an immense amount of evaporation, a ton of water emitted up into the atmosphere, and we would have had a cooling effect from all the aerosols blocking out the sunlight. The perfect conditions that we would need to send the world into an ice age. Now, do we have any biblical support to suggest there indeed was an ice age? And the answer is yes, we do. The book of Job. It's the oldest book in the Bible in terms of when it was written, but we know the events occur post-flood. In Job 22, verse 15 through 16, in the speech by Eliphaz, we read, "Will you keep to the old way, which wicked men have trod, who were cut down before their time, whose foundations were swept away by a flood?" So the events of Job occur post-flood. But what was the climate or environment like where Job lived? We know he lived in the land of Uz, there in the Middle East, not 100% sure, but there, close to where Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, that general part of the world. Now, when you think about that part of the world, do you think about taking ski trips to the Middle East? The answer is no. You think of a big, arid wasteland. But it's interesting to note that the book of Job has more references to cold, snow, ice, and frost than any other book in the Bible. It's like this. If you were going to write and you lived, say, in Florida versus Alaska, well, your writing would probably contain things, if you're living in Florida, related to sunny and warm weather. If you live in Alaska, it would contain things related to cold, icy weather. And so for time's sake, I won't go through every instance, but we have around 5 instances of the use of snow used in Job, 3 instances of ice, 2 instances of frozen. We have the frost, hail, cold, and scattering winds of the north. More references than any other book of the Bible by far. And so we can conclude that the environment of where Job lived in the land of Uz, now Middle East, used to be a lot colder than it is today. So the conclusion from Scripture is the global flood sent the world into an ice age, and we have evidence of that from the book of Job. Now, what's the secular perspective on the idea of ice age? Well, from a secular perspective, they believe there are 5 major ice ages, going back to about 2.4 billion years. The 4 that are before the most recent one that they say is 2.6 million years ago, those are all inferred from data. There's actually is physical evidence for a last ice age, things like glacial moraines, glaciers that still exist on the planet today, glacial till. You don't really have that for the others. They are all inferred. And here's how they get those. There was a Serbian scientist in the 20th century named Milankovitch, and he proposed that based upon the Earth's eccentricity, obliquity, and orbital precession, its wobble, its tilt, and its ellipse around the sun, that those impacted the climate. Now, this was a hypothesis, and he estimated that it was every 100,000 to 400,000 years, the Earth would get a little closer to the sun, we'd have a warmer climate. Away from the sun, colder climate. Tilt of the axis, the wobble, the precision, all these would impact the climate. But this was just an hypothesis. Well, in 1976, there was a paper called The Pacemaker of the Ice Ages. And what they did was they drilled these deep sediment sea cores, and they would look at the oxygen isotope ratios. Now, this gets kind of complicated, so I'm not really going to go into detail here. But they basically looked at a bunch of wiggles on a line and said, well, this one looks like about 100,000 years, 40,000 years, and 21,000 years. And so these wiggles must tell us when these ice ages occur. So they just go across and start counting all the wiggles. And so they would actually say, based upon the number of wiggles, there's been about 50 of these interglacial ice periods since that last major ice age, which they say is 2.3 million years ago. There are a lot of assumptions and circular reasoning in all of this. And I have other presentations and slides where I go into some of these uniformitarianistic assumptions. But let me just deal briefly with ice cores, because ice cores come up a lot of time on this discussion. There's only been about 5 to 6 of these ice cores drilled. They're several thousands of feet in length. They've been taken from Greenland and the Antarctic. And here's what they do. They go through there and they count these rings, and basically the idea is each ring represents a season when dust would come in and a new layer of ice would be added on top. So we count those rings, and they try to argue that the Earth is, or at least those ice sheets are several hundreds of thousands of years from that alone. But again, the problem is the assumptions that they make in this process. And we know these assumptions are wrong just from this one example. In 1988, there was a World War II plane that was discovered under 260 feet of ice. Well, we know when that plane was manufactured. It was manufactured in 1942. What's the problem? The average accumulation rate of ice in Greenland was about just a few feet, or around 1 foot, a few inches per year. But by this calculation, it would have had to average 5 feet of ice per year for 46 years. So the present is not the key to the past. Their assumptions are simply incorrect. But either way, we do know that we were in an ice age and we are coming out. The biblical and the secular model agree. It used to be colder. Now things are warming up. So what's the biblical perspective when it comes to climate change? Well, I would argue very simply, as Christians, we believe in climate change. I think the Bible teaches that climate has changed. I would just argue that the reason for the change of climate is not based upon man's CO2 emission, rather it's been based upon man's sin. Beginning in Genesis chapter 1, we understand that the climate must have been very good because God's creation was very good. But the problem was sin. In Genesis chapter 3, sin entered the world, and as a result, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 5 that just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men. And so creation started to become corrupt, and sin started to fill the world until we get to the time of Noah. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 13, we read, "And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." So before the Genesis flood, creation climate must have been very good. Probably a warm tropical type climate if I had to guess. And then after the flood, we get sent into this cool global ice age. Genesis 8, 20 through 22, "While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night shall not cease." So the notion that the earth is simply going to burn up and boil due to man's CO2 emissions simply is in contrast to what the Word of God teaches. Peter talks about some of these assumptions. 2 Peter chapter 3, 1 through 13. He says, "Beloved, I now write to you the second epistle, in both of which to stir up your pure minds by way of reminder, that you may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets, and of the commandment of us, the apostles of the Lord and Savior, knowing this first. Scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lust, saying, 'Where is the promise of his coming?'" These are uniformitarianists. They assume that the present is just always as it's been. He goes on, "For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, the earth standing out of the water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men." He goes on and notes, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night." It's not going to come based upon our CO2 emissions. We don't know when that day will come, but we do know the climate will change again, and it will get hot, and it will burn this world up, but it's not because of CO2 emissions. It says the elements will melt with a fervent heat, both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. So yes, we as Christians believe in climate change. What about our view of the environment? I think we should spend a few minutes and talk about this. You know, we're called to be good stewards of God's creation. We don't just use and burn fossil fuels for the sake of destroying the planet. We use them because I believe we better humanity. We actually improve and make the planet better. But we are called to have the dominion mandate and use God's creation fruitfully as good stewards. Genesis 1:28, "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" This was one of the responsibilities given in the garden, that they were to tend and keep it. In Psalm 104, 10 through 14, it says, "He sends the springs into the valleys. They flow among the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. By them the birds of the heaven have their home. They sing among the branches. He waters the hills from his upper chambers. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your works. He causes the grass to grow for the cattle and the vegetation for what? For the service of man, that he may bring forth food from the earth." Proverbs 12 and verse 10, "A righteous man regards the life of his animal." We're to take care of our livestock, of our animals. We're not to be cruel to them. Isaiah 45:18, "For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens, who is God, who formed the earth and made it, who has established it, who did not create it in vain, who formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, there is no other." He created the world to be inhabited. Some would suggest today that we need to reduce our population because we're destroying the world. That is simply an anti-biblical proposition. Luke chapter 13 also speaks of tending to God's creation, talks about the fig tree. But ultimately, the problem we have in the world, as we saw with that seminary up in New York where they're confessing to plants, is that people start to worship the creation rather than the creator. Romans chapter 1, verse 22, Paul writes, professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, in birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Therefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness, in the lust of their hearts to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. So, again, to put all this into perspective, from a biblical standpoint, there was an ice age. Secularists agree with that. And from a biblical standpoint, the climate has changed, and we are called to be good stewards of it. Now let's get to where things are going to get political in the secular perspective. What is the secular perspective on climate change? Well, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I think this represents it well. People are concerned. They think that the world is going to burn up, and unless we take immediate drastic action now to curb our fossil fuel consumption or our carbon emissions, the world is going to blow up. And it's why you have these younger generations who are literally willing to stop traffic or deface property or glue themselves to a street, I think I saw once. And so this idea of ESG investing, environmental social governance, the entire woke ideology, and they would have us believe that you have on one side those who care about the planet and those who are just industrial capitalists. All they care about is corporate profit and greed. I would suggest it is not that clear. Well, let's explain and understand where they're coming from and what the basis of what they're saying is. It's called the greenhouse effect. We have two major sources of heat on this planet. We have that which is geothermal that comes up from the planet, and then we have that which comes from the sun. And when the radiation comes from the sun, we have a blanket over our Earth we call the atmosphere. Some of that sunlight will be reflected by that atmosphere. Some of it will be absorbed and re-emitted, and then it will be maintained inside of that blanket. And the atmosphere is made up of greenhouse gases. It's the same idea of having a greenhouse where you can grow some plants throughout cold season because you can keep the temperature warmer inside of a greenhouse. And there's several greenhouses. You have oxygen, or they'll call it ozone, O3, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, water vapor, H2O, methane. And basically the idea is that the more CO2 we put out there, the more methane we put out there, the thicker blanket we're making. The more that energy is absorbed, the more it is trapped, and the warmer our climate will become. Well, if you look at the temperatures that have been recorded since 1880, before the Industrial Revolution, it's true. When you look at it, it looks like temperatures have risen. Now that is a chart in centigrade, or Celsius, and so to convert that to something we're more familiar with, this chart essentially says that the temperature has risen since 1880 on average globally by around 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what all the fuss is over, about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. But they say it could rise a whole lot more, and this would cause all the ice to melt and sea levels to rise, and people will be displaced. Let me start here. I am very skeptical of any of the claims that come out of climate science. And I find this chart to be very important. Let me explain it. There was a study done. They went back to 1990, and they looked at a ton of different scientific disciplines. And they said, okay, you're applying for a grant. You said, here's our hypothesis. Here's what we're going to go research, and here's what we hope to find. Well, generally, when you're going to do a study, you're going to put out a hypothesis, and you're going to do a study to see whether or not that's correct. Now, I've asked my friends, I said, if you're going to put forward a hypothesis, what frequency or what percent of the time do you think you're always going to be proven right? I mean, just by a flip of the coin, it'd be less than 50%. But usually the answer I get is, well, probably less than 20, maybe even less than 10% of the time. In 1990, all the scientific disciplines added together, 70% of the results that they thought they were going to go and test were affirmed in the positive. What does that tell you? There's a lot of bias. And that has now grown to 85 to 90%. I'll tell you the disciplines where this is really bad is where you get a lot of numbers and you get to do statistical data manipulation. You see it a lot in psychology, climate science, and medical science. Think vaccine research. So this was my first introduction to climate science. I was an undergrad at Angelo State University, and they had this guest speaker in. His name was Michael Mann, pretty big name in the climate industry. He became famous for this chart he produced in the late 90s. It's called the hockey stick. And he claimed to use ice cores, tree rings, historical records to build this temperature profile going back over 1,000 years. And what he claimed to show is, look, everything is in decrease, but then as soon as man starts to use fossil fuels, the Industrial Revolution, boom, shoots up. So we're obviously impacting and destroying the climate. Well, you can go dig into that if you want to. He's been tied up in a lot of lawsuits for the last 20 years. And he's been sued. He's suing people, couldn't give data, something called Climate Gate. It looked like they were manipulating data. A lot going on with that. But here's what he showed, and it stood out to me when he came and spoke at Angelo State. It's in West Texas. We have a lot of droughts. We have lakes that will go dry. And this lake here, he showed this picture. It's our local state park. It's called O.C. Fisher. He basically said, look, here's the effects of climate. Y'all are going to run out of water. All your lakes are going dry. Well, I didn't know really much about this lake at the time, but this was a lake created about 70 years ago or so, because back in the early 90s, San Angelo flooded. And they built this lake to prevent flooding. But it's a very shallow lake. It's also surrounded by mesquite trees that have deep taproots, that have high evaporation rates. And so this is not a lake designed to hold water. It's a lake that has gone dry before. It will go dry again. In fact, last year, my children were out there playing when it looked like this, a bunch of mud cracks. 1 week later, we were walking along the dam there, and I saw boats driving out on the lake because we had about 10 inches of rain over one weekend, and the lake jumped 10-20%. And so I immediately became skeptical of the claims of the climate scientist. Come back to Al Gore. In 2000, his net worth was about $1.7 million. Today, it's about $300 million. Where did all that wealth come from after he got out of politics? Well, he sold his cable channel to Qatar, a oil-producing nation in the Middle East, and he did some climate documentaries and books. But one of the most interesting things I remember learning about him was in 2017, there was a report that came out talking about the homes he owned. Big mansion there in Tennessee. And his electrical consumption was about 34 times the average American. So here he is lecturing everyone saying, stop burning fossil fuels, stop consuming so much energy, yet he's using on average 34 times more than what each one of us would be using. And so I've seen a lot of hypocrisy. For example, John Kerry. He's actually a billionaire. He was a climate czar under the Biden administration. He would travel around the world and lecture to people about their use of fossil fuels. And on one instance, he used his private jet to go to Iceland to get a climate award. And he asked, hey, don't you know what that jet runs on? It's fossil fuels, which you're telling everyone to stop using. And he said, well, the only choice for someone like me who is traveling the world to win this battle. The other thing that I have come to realize is all their models are wrong. We have a saying in science that some models are useful, all models are wrong. I would argue the climate models are wrong and they are not useful. If you look at the actual data represented by the blue and green dots there at the bottom versus all the models and their predictions for 1975, they virtually all drastically overpredict what happens in reality. So I want to give you some important questions to think about to help you wade through this subject of climate change. Number one, these questions are rarely ever asked in the media. They're rarely ever brought up, but they deserve to be asked and they deserve to be answered. What is the relationship between CO2 and temperature? It's just assumed by some that it's linear. As CO2 goes up, temperature goes up. Well, if you just look at the ambient CO2, the parts per million, it was around 280 back in 1850, and today it's about 430. Well, you can see it has grown, but what has the temperatures done? Well, they've gone up and they've gone down. They've gone up and they've gone down. Well, how is it possible that temperatures have gone down while CO2 emissions have gone up? That tells me it's not a linear correlation, that there are other things at play. In fact, very rarely will someone talk about what is the absorption coefficient, what is the reflectance coefficient, the transmittance coefficient of these molecules. It's pretty technical stuff. But here's a chart that basically illustrates it. As I add more CO2 to the atmosphere, its impact on the climate actually reduces. And so the first couple hundred parts per million that you add of CO2 has the biggest impact. And you can see from pre-industrial, when it was below 300 to present, a little over 400. But if you look at doubling that to get to 600, the impact on just how it can actually absorb heat and re-emit heat It's not as big of an impact. It's a logarithmic relationship. Most people don't know that. Well, another question I ask is, okay, we're looking at temperatures in this narrow window, but what have temperatures been in the past? We've already talked about the fact that the flood put our world into an ice age. And so things used to be a lot colder than they are now, and we are warming and coming up out of that. But another reconstruction just over the last 2,000 years, there's two periods. You have one called the medieval warm period. That was between AD 900 and 1300. And there's even historical records, but Vikings actually came and colonized Greenland. They were growing plants and farming on Greenland. Until around 1300, we went into a little ice age, is what it's been called. And now the Vikings had to leave. They had to leave Greenland. So this is before all the CO2 emissions. How did those events happen? I think that's important to know. What about this? What is the optimal CO2 concentration for the atmosphere? They're saying we have too much CO2. Well, how much do we want to have? How much is not enough? How much is too much? Well, obviously, if we had no carbon in the atmosphere, we'd all die. Why? Because we have the oxygen cycle. We breathe in oxygen, we breathe out CO2. Plants breathe in CO2, they breathe out oxygen. This is how we live in a symbiotic relationship. Well, the established minimum is about 150 parts per million. That's about the minimum that plants need to live. Currently, we have about 430 parts per million. But if you look at various studies I've done, the optimal range would probably be about 700 to 1,000 parts per million to optimize plant growth. Here's some pictures from Dr. Craig Idso. He's director for the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. And what you see is a pine tree there that was grown with ambient CO2 parts per million. In the next one, you have 150. The next one, you have 300 parts per million added. And the next one, you have 450 parts per million added. And what do you know? Well, when you give plant food, it likes it, and it grows. And they grow bigger and stronger. And they've documented this across all sorts of trees, fruits, vegetables, grains, grasses. Plants like plant food. In fact, here's a chart or a map that shows global greening. This occurs from 2000 to 2017. And the areas highlighted in green have seen more production or more greening of the geography. There are a few areas that have had diminished. Those are the brown areas. But what you notice is overwhelmingly, the earth has become more inhabitable by humans. A lot of those areas up there are in places like Canada, where very few people live because it's very cold, or in Russia. So it turns out that warming the planet is actually good for people. In fact, that's something that's never discussed. Usually if there's going to be change, there's going to be pros, there's going to be cons, there's going to be benefits and negative benefits. So what are the benefits to a warmer climate? If you just look at a map of population density, where do most people live? Do they live in the cold Arctic regions to the north or south? Most people live along the equator in the middle. And it turns out if you just look at the United States of America, most people live in the south or on the coastal environments where you have warmer climates. And one of the reasons you have warmer climates there rather than in the mid-continent to the western part of the country, where you have higher elevations, more mountains, well, there's less humidity in those areas. You get more humidity along the coast because you're beside the oceans. Well, it turns out the number one greenhouse gas for absorbing and retaining heat is water vapor. That's why when I opened the door this morning to get in my truck, I was immediately meted with all the humidity and it felt gross and muggy. If I had opened the door and went out in San Angelo this morning where it's more arid, we call it a dry heat out there, but it feels really nice in the mornings and in the evenings. East Texas, it feels muggy both day and night. Now, something else to think about. A few years ago, we had a winter storm. We even gave it a name called Winter Storm Uri. It was called the snow apocalypse. And some of you probably lived through that. And if you recall, if you didn't have energy and it's freezing temperatures, you might have actually been a little bit nervous. Because the thing is, cold kills. But you're not worried about a heat wave that comes through. We can still go outside. You get hot, get you a cup of water, sit underneath a shade tree. But when it's cold, you have to go find heat. You have to find warmth. You have to find something to help you to live and survive that. And so a warmer climate is actually a better climate and helps people. What about fossil fuels? What's the impact of fossil fuels on human flourishing? I mentioned John Kerry, former czar to travel around the world and tell people to stop burning fossil fuels. Estimated net worth of about $1 billion. In 2022, he traveled to Vietnam to tell them, stop building coal plants, start building solar and wind. Well, the GDP per capita in Vietnam is about $5,000 versus $75,000 in the U.S. per person. This is one of the biggest problems I have with climate change. I think is a real wicked aspect to it, is how they want to keep people who are in the undeveloped worlds from coming to the developed worlds. Take Vietnam. Here's their energy mix, about 45% coal, 26% oil. And what we've seen over time is the life expectancy in Vietnam has increased. The GDP per capita has increased. Vietnam is coming out of poverty into the developed world. And we see that coinciding as they have continued to use more and more fossil fuels, not wind, solar, and pixie dust. Well, Scott Tinker, he is the former director of the Bureau of Economic Geology of Texas at the University of Texas. And I would encourage you, if you want to get into this from someone who I think is a balanced view of it, I would go look up Scott Tinker. He's an amazing presenter. He produced 2 documentaries, Switch and Switch On. In the second documentary, Switch On, he went and visited these countries who are economically poor and energy depraved. And one of those countries was Vietnam. And was the story he shared about Vietnam. He said, Phuc, which means happy in Vietnamese, is 50 years old. Her husband is ill and not able to work. Her 20-year-old son is away at school, and she works and takes care of her 17-year-old handicapped son. Every day she carries him on her back across the wooden bridge, pushes him in a wheelchair to school, and then goes to work in the market to try to earn a living for her family. In her tiny home where I could not stand upright, the solar and wind provide enough electricity to charge 2 12-volt batteries that run 2 fans, charge a cell phone, and a few lights. The batteries are not enough to run lights at night for her son to read. So you have a billionaire telling people they need to stay like that. Here's a chart, CO2 emissions versus life expectancy versus GDP versus population. What do you notice? As we started using fossil fuels, as we started producing CO2 emissions, people are living longer, people are wealthier, and our population is growing. Here's China, India. Used to be pretty poor countries. Still many parts of those countries are. And as you see, they've grown their fossil fuel uses. Now they are living longer. As they have increased fossil fuel use, their GDP per person has increased. As CO2 emissions have increased, we also see that people are not dying from climate near as much. Why? Because if I have gas to keep my house warm when it's freezing outside, I can live. But it used to, if I had to go hunt down or chop down trees and burn biomass, it was a lot harder. So the use of hydrocarbons has actually resulted in less people dying from climate-related deaths. This one has always stood out to me, energy disparities. According to the IEA, International Energy Agency, about 2.8 billion people had no access to electricity in 2021. 3.6 billion people had access to electricity but experienced unreliable or intermittent service. But even today, over 4 billion people living on this planet consume less energy than the average American refrigerator will use in a single year. Think about that. So we're going around and lecturing the world, telling them, don't use fossil fuels, don't better your lives, don't live longer, don't enjoy what we enjoy, because we want to keep enjoying it. Even former presidential candidate Kamala Harris, she said, when we invest in clean energy and electric vehicles, we reduce population. More of our children can breathe clean air and drink clean water. They said that was a misquote or a misread, I guess, off the teleprompter. It was supposed to be pollution, but who knows with her. Either way, that is one of the outcomes of this ideology. We should reduce our population. And in summary, the biblical view is that there was an ice age. It started after the global flood. The secular perspective backs it up, but they make a lot of uniformitarianistic assumptions to say there was a lot more over a lot longer periods. And from the climate change perspective, we believe the climate has changed and it will change, but it is based upon sin. And even if CO2 is impacting the climate, which I think that it probably is, I think there's a lot more pros than there are cons. And when we think about the dominion mandate we have to go and be good stewards of God's planet, I believe we should keep using fossil fuels. We should help lift people out of poverty, and we should use these technologies to further advance the gospel. If you want to dive more into any of this, I've listed a couple of resources, and I have USB sticks in the foyer with access to all these slides among the other presentations I give. Thank you.
I don't know if I'll go.
You probably don't need that because you probably got it all. Forgiveness than permission. So remember that, young man, as you start growing in your relationship with your wife. But don't tell my wife I said that. We also want to introduce our speaker this hour, Daniel Horn, who has a degree in history. The people at BCS probably will not recognize him because he is all spiffied up, and we get to see him spiffied up one time a year.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
That's right.
I haven't been with him to funerals. Do you spiffy for funerals too?
It's
okay.
Yeah.
But I know that what he is going to give to us today is going to be very informative, and you will enjoy what he has for us today. Following the lesson this morning, we're going to have lunch, and after I get through saying a couple of words, I want to ask Trent Kennedy if he'll come up after we get through here and lead a prayer for the food and everything, if you don't mind. And so we're going to turn it over to 10:30 on the dot. You're up.
Good. All right, if you would be turning to Romans chapter 1, that's where we're going to start our study this morning. Before we talk about anything else, we need to talk about this topic that it says on your schedules. I think I've had more questions about what this means than any of the other topics. The last couple of years, Jason assigned me a topic that I didn't know anything about, and this time he outdid himself by not assigning me a topic at all. And I was just as baffled as you are when I first saw it, and I went to Christopher Jaggi and I said, Christopher, look at this topic. Can you make sense of this for me? You know, select archaeological discoveries, blah, 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 blah. And he looks at me and goes, it says select, right? And I said, yes. He says, well, that means select something. So that's what I've done. I've selected something, and that something is what you see here on the screen. We're going to talk about the early church in Rome. And I did tell Jason that this is what I chose. He signed off on it, just so everyone knows. I might make fun of my elders, but I do submit to them. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The Roman Empire casts a shadow over the entire New Testament. This behemoth, this enormous thing, sits in the background of the entire story of the New Testament, Christ, the apostles, and the early church. Roman leaders take part in the trial of Christ. Jewish leaders try to appease their Roman leaders. Paul uses his Roman citizenship to his advantage. Jesus says, pay your taxes to Rome, and the money he talks about in his lessons is Roman currency. Inspired writers use Roman leaders to frame their times and their years. Members of the Roman legions are converted to the faith. An entire book of the New Testament is addressed to Christians living in the Roman capital, and we could go on. The Roman Empire is more than just the setting of the New Testament. It is one of the main characters of the New Testament. And yet our idea of Rome, the way we talk about Rome, suffers from one of the same problems that we usually run into when we talk about ancient history. It focuses on the elites. Roman history, when we talk about it, is always about the wars. It's about the conquests. It's about the army, the Caesars, the intrigue, the assassinations, the great fire. How crazy was Nero? How bad was Caligula? So on and so on and so on. And these things are interesting. They're important. We should talk about them. But they're pretty distant from a regular person's experience of what it would have been like to live in Rome. We know from both scriptural and secular history that while some early Christians were wealthy and influential, and we'll talk about some of those this morning, most of them were not. Christianity in the first century was really a grassroots religion, as Mark 12:37 says, gladly heard by the common man. So we're going to ask a few questions this morning. What was it like to be a Christian in Rome in the first century? What was it like to live there, to worship there, to interact with this giant political thing while living the Christian life? And why did this empire choose, eventually, to persecute them? What led the early Christians to be in conflict with their culture and their government? I subtitled this lesson Seeds of Trial because there are a lot of variables, a lot of glimpses we get of circumstances that made things especially difficult for the young church during this time. We're going to look at three particular variables. This is not exhaustive by any means, but three particular challenges that the early church in Rome would have dealt with. We're going to look at the challenges of integration, isolation, and communication. And these challenges are connected to each other, and together they can show us a small part of what it must have been like to be a Christian in this place. We're going to use the scripture as our foundation. We're going to use some examples from secular history, some archaeology, some historical documents to illuminate the New Testament accounts, to give us details and color that the people of the time would have understood, but that we in the 21st century miss. So the obvious place for this discussion to start is the letter to the Romans. Now in Romans chapter 1, Paul is making his customary greeting, and he's going to address the Christians in Rome. So let's start reading in verse 7. Romans chapter 1, verse 7. To all that be in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers, making request, if by any means now at length I might have a prosperous journey by the will of God to come unto you. For I long to see you, that I may impart unto you some spiritual gift to the end ye may be established, that is, that I may be comforted together with you by the mutual faith both of you and me. So Paul has good things to say about the Romans. Verse 8, he's thankful for them. Verse 9, he's praying for them. I think it's a pretty good thing to have the Apostle Paul praying for you. I would certainly want that. But let's zoom in here on what he says in verse 8 about their faith. He says that it's spoken of throughout the whole world. This tells us first their faith is strong. That's very good. And whatever Rome is like, however difficult it is to be a Christian there, it is possible. They're doing it. We need to remember that whatever the conditions, the faithful can live and grow. But there are a lot of places that are described as faithful in the New Testament. Philippi comes to mind. So why is Rome spoken of throughout the whole world? For one thing, they're in the capital, and whatever happens in the capital is going to matter. But I think also because it is a particularly challenging place to be a Christian. They're doing a good job, but being a Christian in the city of Rome is going to be difficult. Our first challenge is, I actually have a slide out of order here, so let's go back. Our first challenge is integration. Let's go to Romans chapter 2, and we'll read verses 5 through 11 in Romans chapter 2. Romans chapter 2, verse 5. But after thy hardness and impenitent heart, treasurest up unto thyself wrath against the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to every man according to his deeds. To them who by patient continuance in well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, eternal life, but unto them that are contentious and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation, and wrath, tribulation and anguish upon every soul of man that doeth evil, of the Jew first, and also of the Gentile. But glory, honor, and peace to every man that worketh good, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile, for there is no respect of persons with God. So our first problem is integration. Paul spends a lot of time in Romans talking about Jews and Gentiles. He does this in other places in the New Testament as well. And the logical reason is that the Romans are having problems with this, problems between Jews and Gentiles, between the different peoples that make up the church. This is nothing unique, but we can easily imagine how this conflict might have taken on a particular edge in the Gentile capital. In Jerusalem, for example, the Jews were the most dominant ethnicity, and it's just statistical that the church there would be mostly Jews. But Rome is the most powerful Gentile city, the Gentile city in many ways. This means that if the church is going to grow in Rome, Gentiles are going to have to play a bigger role. So what might the practical, physical, daily aspect of this integration have looked like? To answer this, I want us to talk about a place called the Basilica di San Clemente, which is in Rome. What you see here was first built in the 12th century after one of the many sacks of Rome. San Clemente is a minor basilica. It is the seat of a cardinal, so a moderately important Catholic facility, but those are everywhere in Rome. Here's a map. You can see that it's about 500 yards east of the Colosseum in the old traditional part of Rome. So as we were looking here on this outside here, you'll see that there's not that much unique to see at the beginning. We have some really nice, interesting architecture inside, some art. But again, if you've been to Rome, these things are around every corner. That's nothing that special. Stuff like this is everywhere. But the key phrase here is on the surface. And on the surface is one thing about Rome as a whole that we have to remember. Rome is a city of layers. It has built up on itself over time. Sediment, debris, construction, the river flowing through and bringing stuff down, all kinds of things have combined to make this happen. So today, the ground level in Rome, depending on what part of the city you're in, is somewhere between 18 and 60 feet higher than it was in the time of the New Testament. And so what happened to everything at the old ground level? Well, for the most part, they just built straight over the top of it. And here's where the archaeological process comes in, because San Clemente gets a lot more interesting the second you start going down. In 1857, a guy named Joseph Maluli was the prior of San Clemente, and he decided to start digging. He got down a full layer, basically 1 story underground, and found what you see here. This is a 4th century Catholic building, that's the 300s. This is clearly very old, and was the original basilica before the current 12th century one from the 1100s was built over the top of it. And as cool as this is, definitely worth exploring and learning about. There's a lot of interesting art and stuff down here too. Maluli was not done because he remembered Rome is a city of layers, and he knew 1 story was not going to be far enough. So what do you find on the next layer down? On the next layer down, you get a set of late 1st century buildings. And these appear to be, depending on what sources you read, there is some dispute over this and some fuzziness around the edges, some combination of aristocratic property, so maybe a Roman villa, part of an apartment complex seems to be down here, and also, what you see here, a Mithraeum, a temple to the pagan god Mithras. That's what you see here. But we're still not done. In the 1910s, a guy named Louis Nolan was working on a drainage project, I think connecting to something under the Colosseum, and went down even a level further than that. So on this level, we have a 1st century Roman house that they think was destroyed in the Great Fire of Nero in AD 64, but it's a little bit hard to tell. Anytime you get back here, you're making some educated guesses. So that's some of what we're doing here. So we've got 4 layers. We've got the 12th century basilica, the 4th century basilica, the 1st century complex with the pagan temple, and then what looks like the even earlier house. And you can see here kind of an example of what these different levels might have looked like at different time periods. Again, this is a reconstruction, best guess scenario. Now, when we look closely at this house that's on the 4th layer, this is where things get really interesting. This property, best we can tell, was owned by an aristocrat named Titus Flavius Clemens. And this guy was executed in the year AD 95 for being a Christian. Remember his name, we're going to talk about him some more later. But most sources seem to point to the fact that Christian worship took place in his house, and continued to take place there, both before and after he was killed. Most people think that that's why the Catholics eventually decided to put their basilica there. They said, hey, people have been worshiping in this place for a long time, we're going to take this place and co-opt it. So what this means is that although we cannot prove for sure where the Roman Church met in the 1st century, one of our best guesses is this house 60 feet below the Basilica di San Clemente. That's one of our best guesses. So why are we looking at this in the context of integration between Jews and Gentiles? First of all, if this hypothesis is correct, if the Roman Church did meet here at some point in the 1st century, then that means they met in the house of a Gentile. Remember Acts 10:28. It is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come unto one of another nation. Jewish members of the church would have been going to a Gentile's house for worship. We can imagine how difficult this might have been for Jewish Christians who were raised a different way, not only because they were taught not to do it, but also because it would have had some serious social consequences. And we have examples in the New Testament of people getting kicked out of the synagogue for various things. We see that the social pressure was pretty strong. And this could well have led to tensions inside the church between these groups. But also remember that temple of Mithras that was just around the corner. Gentile worship and Gentile customs were never very far away. Remember, cities like Rome were built at more human scales than ours are. Ours are built, with cars. 5 miles away is 5 minutes away. In this day and time, a quarter mile was 5 minutes away. So you've got to think of this a little bit differently. Everything was a stone's throw away from you. Let's say that you converted a follower of Mithraism. That new convert, his option now might just be turn right instead of left in the hallway in his apartment complex in the morning, and now go down a different hall to where the Christians are worshiping. That's entirely possible scenario. The old ways, the Gentile ways, are just right there, a few feet away. So if you're a Christian in this time, you might have to ask yourself the question, how can I trust this new convert? Literally last week, I saw him down the hall sacrificing to Mithras. Is this guy a mole? What's going on? Remember, Mark 3:25, a house divided cannot stand, and that's why Paul spends a lot of time on this. But we see no wonder Jews and Gentiles had tensions when they're all crammed in on top of each other this way. And it's easy to see the kind of external consequences you might get from division as well. Rome was purposefully structured as a multi-ethnic, multinational empire, and cooperation between ethnic groups was key to them maintaining law and order. So what happens when a new religious group appears? They take believers away from Judaism, they take believers away from the traditional religions, they make everybody mad, and then maybe they have ethnic tensions inside as well. So it's no wonder the church became a target. So we see that integration in the Roman church would have been extra difficult, partially because of Jewish custom, partially because of the Roman preference for law and order, and partially because of just how hard it was to physically distance themselves from their old ways, from their old Gentile pagan worship. But distance played a different role in our second point, which is isolation. Because while Christians were not isolated from Gentile society, they couldn't be, they were surrounded by it, they were often isolated from each other. Let's read in Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15, we'll start reading in verse 20. Verse 20 says, "Yea, so have I strived to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build upon another man's foundation. But as it is written, to whom he was not spoken of, they shall see, and they that have not heard shall understand. For which cause also I have been much hindered from coming to you. But now having no more place in these parts, and having a great desire these many years to come unto you, whensoever I take my journey into Spain, I will come to you. For I trust to see you in my journey, and to be brought on my way thitherward by you, if first I be somewhat filled with your company. But now I go into Jerusalem to minister unto the saints. For it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. It hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal things. When therefore I have performed this, and have sealed to them this fruit, I will come by you into Spain. And I am sure that, when I come unto you, I shall come in the fullness of the blessing of the gospel of Christ." So we remember back in chapter 1, we read that Paul was longing to see the Romans. He really wanted to make this trip. He was praying for a prosperous journey to come to them. Here in chapter 15, he says that he's been hindered from coming by various things, verse 22, but that he still has a great desire to see them, verse 23, and that he trusts that he will be able to do so, verse 24. He then says that he thinks he'll be able to come through Rome as a waypoint on his planned trip to Spain. Now, we know from the book of Acts that Paul did eventually get to Rome, not exactly how he planned it, not on the way to Spain, but as a prisoner of the state. And we remember some of the details and the difficulty that he went through on that trip. Stopping at ports, changing boats, storms, shipwreck, snake bites, all kinds of things. And I think we have some innate understanding that it was harder to get around than it was harder to travel. The world was a bigger place, travel was slower, and it was more expensive, relatively speaking, to connect people and things. People were farther apart from each other. But what exactly does that mean? How do we quantify, for our understanding, how hard it was for Paul to get to Rome, or really any of the Christians to get anywhere? Well, we don't have to guess. We're going to use the results of some research, and thankfully, somebody else's research. This is, hopefully we can see everything well, this is a tool called Orbis, and I have lost several hours of my life to this tool. The full name is Orbis, the Stanford Geospatial Model of the Roman World. And you might guess it was made by some researchers at Stanford. When you open it up, you see this. It's a website with a picture of the Mediterranean on it, and here on the left we see several different options. So what is this? What are we going to do with this? According to their website, it says, Orbis reconstructs the time cost and financial expense associated with a wide range of different types of travel in antiquity. The model is based on a simplified version of the giant network of cities, roads, rivers, and sea lanes that framed movement across the Roman Empire. It broadly reflects conditions around 200 AD, but also covers a few sites and roads created in late antiquity. It goes on to say, our model seeks to improve our understanding of how a large-scale system, such as the Roman Empire, worked, of the effort it took to succeed in the struggle to connect and control tens of millions of people across hundreds and thousands of miles of land and sea. So essentially what you can do with this is you choose a starting and ending point and a time of year, and it will calculate your route, your travel time, and your expense for traveling between those two places during the time of the Roman Empire. So this is Google Maps for ancient Rome. That's what we got here. So let's try it out and see what we can learn that's relevant to our discussion. Now, I've animated this for us because I know that trying to do demos in real time always goes poorly. We'll see how good the videos do. So we're going to start with a medium range one. Okay, hopefully you can see the animation that the mouse is moving. We're going to start with a medium range one that someone in the early church might have done. We're going to do Antioch, Antiochia, this is all in Latin, so we're going to do Antioch to Corinth. So we're going to choose those from the drop-down. We're going to say, when are we traveling? We're going to say summertime. We're going to say we want the fastest option. We don't really care about cheapest or shortest. Let's say our elders have given us a good budget here. And we can do road, river, coastal sea, open sea. That doesn't really matter to us. We're going to do calculate route. So we're going to watch it calculate, and then I've got a freeze frame here of what it gives us at the end. And we can zoom in on the individual segments of this trip if we want to. You'll notice, for example, we have a stop at Halicarnassus, which would probably be a fun layover. But the main things I want us to focus on are down here in the bottom left, the time and the cost associated with this trip, which I have zoomed in on for us here. So the fastest journey from Antioch to Corinth in July took 13.9 days. And it covered 1,585 kilometers, that's 985 miles in freedom units, and they were covering about 71 miles a day, best case scenario. And we're driving 75 miles an hour, sometimes a lot faster, and they're going 71 miles a day, best case scenario. But then look over here on your right. We have prices in denarii. We have freight prices, so a kilogram of wheat would have taken around 2 denarii to ship from Antioch to Corinth. But look here, we have per passenger cost is about 385 denarii to travel one way from Antioch to Corinth. Well, how much is that? It's kind of hard to say, but I did find one source that seemed to be pretty reliable that placed the annual pay for a Roman soldier in the year 200, which this model is built around, at 600 denarii. There had been a little inflation since Jesus' time, but it was 600 denarii at this point. So this means that if a soldier's pay was 600 denarii, and we'll say that he's a regular average guy, and he wants to go from Antioch to Corinth, it would have taken him 2 weeks and 8 months' pay. If we convert that to our money, Google said the median per capita income in this country is $43,000. I don't know how accurate that is, but let's just say that it is. If that's the case, then 8 months' pay would be the equivalent of around $28,700 today. I don't know that many of us would be considering a 2-week trip that costs $28,000, especially since that's one way, that's one direction. If you want to get back, you can double that. So, basically $56,000 to get to Corinth and back. That's not doable for a whole lot of people. Well, let's do a different one. Let's do the one that is kind of conceptually like what Paul might have done. Let's do Jerusalem to Rome. So we're gonna choose our same options here. We're gonna do Jerusalem starts with an I because they didn't have J's, and then you have Roma. We're gonna calculate the same thing: summertime, fastest route. Let's say we've got the money we need, and so it gives us this route, which is about what we would expect. We see some waypoints in Greece and stuff like that, and then we're gonna look at our freeze frame here. So let's look at our same numbers for this calculation. We see that it was 28.4 days, so about 4 weeks just to get there one way, if things go well. We've got about 3,200 kilometers, nearly 2,000 miles, again, a brisk pace of 70 miles per day, and 770 denarii, which is well over a year's salary for a one-way trip from Jerusalem to Rome. Again, good luck if you want to get back home. So when we start to look at numbers like this, several things in the New Testament begin to make more sense. We start to understand why it was hard for Paul to get where he wanted to go. He couldn't just drop what he was doing and go to Rome for the weekend. It wasn't going to work that way. We understand better the need, I think, for miraculous revelation. I mean, how else is information going to spread across these kinds of distances? Very slowly and somewhat unreliably. We understand that a lot of poor Jews across the empire, for example, would not have been able to come back to Jerusalem for the feast days. There's just no way. If you're just a regular guy living in Rome and you're a Jew, you're going to spend $100,000 round trip to go back for the feast days? Probably not. Probably not. There's a reason the Ethiopian eunuch was there. He could afford the trip. And we see just how big a deal it would have been to get a letter from Paul or even a visit from Paul, Timothy, or Apollos. So we see that groups of Christians were isolated from each other, both by distance and by cost. What would it have been like to be a Christian in Rome? I think it would have felt pretty isolated. Each congregation would have been an island in a sea of paganism, days, weeks, and really fortunes away from the apostles and from your sister congregations. And then we also begin to see the wisdom of God's plan of church organization here. Do we really think that in this scenario, where it takes months and the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars to get around, that God's goal was to centralize church authority in one man in Rome? I mean, that's just crazy. I mean, as slow as communication was, as fragile as these networks were, and as expensive as they are, to think that God wanted the city of Rome to be preeminent over the church is just crazy. The early church would not have survived these kinds of distances without the congregational autonomy that we are blessed with in the body of Christ. But there is another side to that coin. Because in the early days of the church, when Christians were few and far between, this isolation made Christianity an easy target for rumors and for lies. And this brings us to our third idea, communication, or really miscommunication. Let's think back to that guy we mentioned earlier, Titus Flavius Clemens. We mentioned that he was executed and that it seemed to be for being a Christian, which is true, but that's not quite the whole story. Let's read an excerpt from Cassius Dio, who was a Roman historian who wrote around the year 200. If you can't read it, that's okay. I'm going to read it for us. But this is Cassius Dio writing around the year 200 in his book, Roman History. In the same year, Domitian slew, and best we can tell, this is around 95 AD, along with many others, Flavius Clemens the consul. That's our guy. Although he was a cousin and had to wife Flavia Domitilla, who was also a relative of the emperor's. This charge brought against them both was that of atheism, a charge on which many others who drifted into Jewish ways were condemned. Some of these were put to death, and the rest were at least deprived of their property. So Cassius says he wasn't executed for Christianity, he was executed for atheism. What? What could be farther from Christianity than atheism? How do we explain this? And as it turns out, atheism was one of the least nasty things that Christians were accused of. Around 176 or 77 AD, there was a guy named Athenagoras of Athens, and he wrote a document called A Plea for the Christians. Now, Athenagoras was a philosopher, he was a Platonist, he didn't have all his ideas right, but he was somewhat of a Christian apologist. And he wrote this document to the Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius, defending Christianity against many of the common accusations that were directed at it. It's a really long document, we're not going to go into all of it, but we are going to look at one short section here from chapter 3 of this document that he wrote. He says, 3 things are alleged against us: atheism, Thyestean feasts, and Oedipian intercourse. But if these charges are true, spare no class. Proceed at once against our crimes, destroy us root and branch with our wives and children, if any Christian is found to live like the brutes. Now, the first of these 3 allegations is a word that we recognize, atheism. We know what that is. We may not yet understand how you can accuse Christians of being atheists, but we'll get to that in a minute and we'll explain. These other 2, Thyestean feasts and Oedipian intercourse, may not be familiar to us, but they are arguably worse. If you want the gory details, you can go look up each of these in your Greek literature. The plays of Sophocles are a good place to start for that. But for right now, you can take my word for it that Thyestean feasts means cannibalism, and Oedipian intercourse means incest. So, according to the ancient Romans, the 3 pillars of Christian living were atheism, cannibalism, and incest. That was their picture of Christianity. So we'll go through each of these in turn and try to figure out exactly how so many Romans came up with this warped conception of Christianity. First, atheism. We know that religion in the Roman Empire was polytheistic. Remember Paul walking through Athens in Acts 17, he says, y'all are way too superstitious. Look at all these gods around here. Well, what form did that superstition normally take? Take a look at this. This on the left here is what's called a lararium, and this is one that was found in Pompeii, preserved from the eruption. And this is essentially what a Roman person would have in their house. This is their home shrine, their home worship location, essentially. And here on the right, you have kind of a reconstructed one, because when you have a volcanic eruption, everything inside it burns up, so the stone is left. But on the right here, you have little carved idols, basically action figures, you could say, of the Roman gods. And these are what you would have in your house and what you would venerate at home. You might choose particular ones you liked more, and those would be the ones that you focused on, but everybody would have some of these in their house. You'd have a few of the gods in your house. So when you convert to Christianity, what are you going to do? You're going to throw out your old gods. You're going to throw out everything that's in the lararium. You're going to empty it out. Maybe you keep it, maybe you don't, but it's going to look more like on the left than it does on the right. It's going to be empty. Now your friend comes over to your house. What do they see? Either shrine is gone or shrine is empty. Those are the two options. Either way, no gods. What does no gods equal? Atheist. Let's put it another way. Let's say you're a Christian and your friend asks you whether you think the gods are real, and they start going down the list. Jupiter, you think Jupiter's real? Nah, Jupiter's not real. Neptune? Nope, not real. Mars? Nope, not real. Gods of the Carthaginians? Nope, not real. God of the Jews? Yep, yeah, that one's real. Okay. Gods of the barbarians? Nope, not real. Your friend then says, man, you believe in almost none of the gods. You're basically an atheist. That was their understanding. From the Roman perspective, one God is a lot closer to zero than thousands of gods. And that's why they called Christians atheists. Christians with one God might as well just be atheists. Now, the other two are a little bit trickier. Cannibalism, let's go to John chapter 6. And let's try to put ourselves in the mindset of someone who had never been exposed to Christian ideas before. John chapter 6, and we'll start reading in verse 53. Then Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, except ye eat the flesh of the Son of Man, and drink his blood, ye have no life in you. Whoso eateth my flesh, and drinketh my blood, hath eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is meat indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He that eateth my flesh, and drinketh my blood, dwelleth in me, and I in him. As the living Father hath sent me, and I live by the Father, so he that eateth me, even he shall live by me. Now to us, this is obviously figurative. We understand the symbolism of the Lord's Supper. But imagine you're a Roman Gentile in the first century, and you have zero frame of reference for that. You hear there's a new religion across town that meets every Sunday. You say, oh, that's interesting. What do they do when they meet? Well, they said they eat some guy's flesh and drink his blood. They what? So we see how this misunderstanding can take place. And this is the rumor that spread. Now, where does the accusation of incest come from? Let's go to 1 Timothy 5. 1 Timothy 5, verses 1 and 2. Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren. The elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters, with all purity. Now again, we understand the difference between a spiritual brother or sister and a physical one. But without context, without exposure to Christian ideas that we've had for hundreds of years in our civilization, this is not an obvious distinction to make. In the church, we refer to each other as brother and sister. Your spouses are your spiritual brothers and sisters. That's just how it is. But if a Roman overhears that discussion, overhears a husband or wife calling each other brother and sister, you can see, with no education, how this can be misunderstood. Remember, no one knew anything about Christianity. It was new. It was not part of the culture. There was no established knowledge base to work from. So it seems almost inevitable that, in retrospect, that Christians would be misunderstood to some extent. So let's go to Romans chapter 1. Because I want us to ask what happened when people actually came in contact with Christians. Because, again, let's think about what the Christian is going to feel like. Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 29. Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful. These are the things they're being accused of. These are the things they've made effort to come out of. So you feel bad about this. You're going to feel like I'm trying as hard as I can. They're misunderstanding me. But what happened when people actually came in contact with Christians? Not listen to the rumors, not just go to the grapevine. What did they see when they actually came in contact with them? When they replaced rumors with firsthand knowledge, what did they find? Let's go to 1 Peter 1, because we can find an answer from the eastern part of the empire. And in 1 Peter 1, Peter says that he is writing to, he says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And Bithynia here is the key that we want to focus on. Around the year 110, there was a guy named Pliny the Younger, and he was the governor of Bithynia. And he wrote a fascinating letter to the Roman Emperor Trajan about what to do with some Christians he had found. We're going to read some of this, a fair amount of it, because it is very relevant to what we're discussing, but we are skipping a lot too, so I recommend you go read the whole thing. So Pliny to the Emperor Trajan in the year 110. It is my practice, my lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt. For who can better give guidance to my hesitation or inform my ignorance? I have never participated in trials of Christians. I therefore do not know what offenses it is the practice to punish or investigate, and to what extent. In the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. That sounds familiar. There were others possessed of the same folly, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. Sounds like Paul. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. I therefore postponed the investigation and hastened to consult you. For the matter seemed to me to warrant consulting you, especially because of the number involved. It is easy to imagine what a multitude of people can be reformed if an opportunity for repentance is afforded. Now, there's a lot to break down here. First of all, being a Christian is obviously already illegal by this point. He's executing Christians who won't renounce their faith. We see that religion was used as an extension of the state to enforce political loyalty to the Roman Empire. Refusing to worship the Roman gods was seen as disloyalty. It's funny, they hadn't heard of the separation of church and state yet. That's very interesting. We've got a great description of the acts of worship in here. Sounds pretty accurate. Meet together, pray, sing, exhort each other to good works, and then have what looks like a meal to the Roman. That sounds about right. But the most interesting thing to me is that Pliny is unsure of himself. He's not sure how harsh he should be on these Christians. And the reason is, when he looks at them, they're actually not doing anything bad. In fact, all they're doing is meeting one day a week to sing and pray. Are you sure we need to kill these guys? So, when a Roman actually examined Christianity, what did they see? Simple devotion and obedience to the Scriptures. That's it. Let's go to Romans chapter 13. We'll read verses 1 and 2. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. We mentioned at the beginning of the lesson that we know Christians were eventually going to be persecuted by Rome. That started at different times in different parts of the empire. It had different levels of thoroughness. All of that is stuff that we can discuss, but we do know that it happened. And I think now we've seen some of the misunderstandings and the differences that led to that persecution. But I think we also should now have a better understanding of why Paul put this message about submission to government in Romans 13. Remember back to our map of Rome. These Christians lived down the street from the Roman Forum. I mean, it wasn't that big a place at the time. Down the street from the seat of worldly Gentile power. This power was going to torture them and execute them for refusing to renounce Christ and for refusing to bow the knee to Caesar and to his gods. And what does Paul say? Does he say, rebel? Does he say, fight back? Take up arms against this tyrannical dictatorship? No taxation without representation? No. He says, submit yourselves anyway. He says, obey the laws anyway. He says, pay your taxes anyway. For all that we like to complain about liberalism or postmodernism or whatever else we're talking about that day, it is pretty easy relatively speaking, to be a Christian in the United States of America today. It is easy, and that should scare us to death, because I have to think that if our task is easier than the one the Roman Christians faced, how much harsher will our judgment be if we fail? Now for some concluding thoughts. In Pliny's letter, we read that he called Christianity a depraved, excessive superstition. This idea of superstition meant something very specific in Roman culture. It wasn't just what we think where, like Friday the 13th is bad or whatever. It meant doing or believing more than was necessary. The idea that you actually had to believe and to do was a pretty foreign concept in this time. Essentially, the Romans thought these Christians are a bunch of tryhards. They care way too much about their religion. It seems like they actually believe the things they say. And would you look at that, they actually act on those beliefs too. When the Romans eventually co-opted Christianity and started to warp it into what we now know as Catholicism, they turned it into something much like the paganism they were used to. They built temples full of icons. They introduced meaningless and repetitive prayers and rituals. They turned it into something that only required obedience and not true belief. They turned it into a tool of oppression, an instrument for the power of their state, an enemy of free thought and truth. It was and is a powerful institution, but it has not won. True Christianity survives. We started this morning by looking at the Basilica di San Clemente, one potential location the Lord's Church may have met in ancient Rome. I got to visit Rome. I did go to that basilica in 2017. I have to say, if you can go to Rome, you have to go. Forget Disney World. Drop that. Go to Rome. It's so much better. Clear your plans. It's that good. When I was there, I worshiped with the Lord's Church at a congregation in a street called Via Sanio. And this is the outside of their church building, and here's where it is on Google Maps. Everything was in Italian. I struggled a little bit with that. I had to use what Latin and Spanish I have to try to decipher the songbook and the PowerPoint the best I could. But it was us. It was the Lord's Church, and they're meeting in Rome today. And wouldn't you know it, they were studying the book of Romans. I think if there was a letter to the Texans, I'd study that pretty often too, But something interesting happens when you zoom out just a little bit on this map. This is where the church meets in Via Sanio, down here at the bottom. Hopefully this is visible enough up there. Yeah, we got our red there. I'm colorblind, so I can't see the red. We've got where the church meets in Via Sanio, and here, about 400 yards away, just around the corner, is the Archbasilica di San Giovanni in Laterano, the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran. Now, we all know about St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. We recently all saw the new Pope elected. We came out on the balcony, gave a speech and whatever, and that's a cool place. You should go there and see it. It's worth seeing. But we don't hear as much about the Basilica, the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran, because in Catholicism, it's actually, technically speaking, more important. This is the Pope's throne, his actual one, the real one that makes him, in Catholicism, Bishop of Rome, and therefore head of the Roman Catholic Church. It's not in St. Peter's in the Vatican. It's not there. It's in St. John Lateran. And the Pope's throne is in the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran because St. John Lateran is not just a Catholic building, it is the Catholic building. In fact, it's the only archbasilica in the entire world because it is the official cathedral of the Diocese of Rome, and as such, the seat of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. This is the inscription on the front of the building. It's in Latin, and translated, this last phrase here says, "Mother and head of all churches in Rome and in the world." So listen to what I am saying. Today, in 2025, the Lord's Church meets 375 yards from the Pope's throne, right now. I think that's pretty interesting. The early church in Rome faced a lot of problems. They were isolated. They were misunderstood. Ethnic tensions divided them. An oppressive state hemmed them in. We're not quite so isolated today. Communication and travel is pretty easy for us. But the rest of it sounds familiar. We're misunderstood. We are mislabeled. Ethnic and economic tensions still divide the church far too often. And regardless of who is running the government is still not the friend of the church and will not be anytime soon. But we can and will survive. I think we would do well to remember that the Lord's Church is by nature somewhat of a subversive organization. whether it is paganism, Catholicism, worldliness, what have you. We live and prosper right under the noses of our enemies. Just like in ancient Rome, just like today. The church is and can be everywhere because the gospel is and can be everywhere. I'm thankful that we can look at the things the Roman church went through, and we can think it might be difficult, it might be tough. But if we stay true to the scripture, I think we're going to be just fine. Thank you.